The night Daniel Hayes reached for his last dollar, he had no idea the elegant stranger behind him would change everything. But first, she would shatter his pride completely. Stay with me until the very end of this incredible journey, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world. Part 1. The fluorescent lights of Miller's Corner store buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across Daniel Hayes's weathered face as he stood frozen at the checkout counter. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he counted the crumpled bills and scattered coins for the third time, hoping against hope that somehow the math would change. 87 cents. He was 87 cents short. Behind him in the shopping cart, 18-month-old Lila whimpered softly, her tiny fists rubbing at eyes red from crying. The cheap diapers he'd grabbed from the clearance shelf seemed to mock him now. Even these, the store's most basic brand, were beyond his reach tonight. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 years ago, he'd been installing luxury bathroom fixtures in million-dollar homes. Now he couldn't afford to keep his baby girl dry. "Sir?" The teenage cashier's voice cut through his thoughts, impatient and slightly annoyed. Her name tag read Ashley, and she couldn't have been more than 16, probably working her first job, while Daniel fought to keep his family afloat. "Are you going to pay for these or not?" "There's a line." Daniel's throat felt like sandpaper. He glanced back at the growing queue of customers, their faces ranging from bored indifference to open irritation. A woman in yoga pants tapped her manicured nails against her phone case. A businessman in an expensive suit checked his Rolex face with theatrical exasperation. "I'm sorry." Daniel began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I had enough, but I'm just 87 cents short." Ashley finished her tone, making it clear this wasn't her problem to solve. "Look, I can hold these for you if you want to come back tomorrow, but I can't." "Oh, for crying out loud!" the businessman interrupted, stepping forward aggressively. His cologne was overpowering, probably costing more than Daniel made in a week at the auto shop. Some people shouldn't have kids if they can't afford to take care of them. This is ridiculous. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. His face flushed hot with shame, and he felt every eye in the store boring into him. The businessman's comment hung in the air like poison gas, and Daniel could hear murmurs of agreement from other customers. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every instinct screaming at him to defend himself, to explain that he'd lost everything when his construction company went under, that his wife's medical bills had drained their savings before cancer took her away, that he was working 2 jobs and still barely keeping their heads above water. But what was the point? These people saw only what stood before them, a man in work boots and a faded t-shirt who couldn't afford a $12 pack of diapers. They didn't see the nights he went without dinner so Lila could eat. They didn't see him studying for his GED by lamplight, after she fell asleep, determined to build a better future for both of them. They didn't see the way he sang her to sleep every night, promising her that things would get better even when he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "I'm sorry," Daniel said again, reaching for the diapers to put them back. His pride was already in tatters. There was no point in prolonging this humiliation. I'll take them all." The voice came from directly behind him, calm and assured, cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. Daniel turned to see a woman he hadn't noticed before, though how he'd missed her was a mystery. She was probably in her early 40s, with platinum blonde hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, and wearing a charcoal gray coat that probably cost more than Daniel's rent. But it wasn't her obvious wealth that caught his attention. It was her eyes. They were the palest blue he'd ever seen, almost silver, and they held a depth of understanding that seemed impossible for a stranger to possess. "Excuse me." Ashley blinked, clearly confused by this turn of events. The woman stepped forward with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command, her heels clicking softly against the worn linoleum. "The diapers," she said simply, her voice carrying just a hint of an accent Daniel couldn't place. "And whatever else he needs, add it to my purchase." She gestured to her own basket, which Daniel now saw was filled with expensive organic groceries, imported chocolates, and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than he made in a day. The contrast between their two worlds couldn't have been starker yet. She was offering to bridge that gap without hesitation. "Ma'am, you don't understand." Daniel started, his pride flaring even in the face of her kindness. "I'm not looking for charity. I just miscalculated, that's all. I can come back tomorrow when your daughter spends another night in a wet diaper." The woman's voice was gentle but firm. She looked directly at Lila, who had stopped crying and was staring at this newcomer with wide, curious eyes. "Children don't understand poverty, Mr. Hayes," Daniel supplied reluctantly. "Daniel Hayes, and this is Lila." "Hello, Lila," the woman said softly, and something magical happened. Lila smiled, actually smiled for the first time all day. The woman turned back to Daniel, and he found himself caught in those silver eyes again. "I'm Clara Monroe, and I'm not offering charity, Mr. Hayes. I'm offering understanding." Before Daniel could respond, Clara had already moved to the counter, pulling out a black credit card that caught the light like obsidian. "Ashley, isn't it?" she said, reading the girl's name tag. "Please ring up Mr. Hayes's items with mine, and add some baby food formula and those wipes on aisle 3. "But I don't need," Daniel began. "Yes, you do." Clara's voice brooked no argument, but it wasn't unkind. "Trust me, I know exactly what you need." The businessman who had made the cruel comment earlier was now staring at Clara with obvious recognition dawning on his face. "Wait a minute," he said, his tone shifting from irritation to something approaching awe. "You're Clara Monroe, Monroe Industries. I heard you speak at the Henderson Business Summit last year." Clara didn't even glance at him. "Ashley," she said, keeping her attention focused on the teenager behind the counter. "How much is the total?" $47.50. Ashley stammered, clearly overwhelmed by this unexpected turn of events. Clara handed over her card without hesitation, then turned to face the businessman while they waited for the transaction to process. When she spoke, her voice was arctic. "You know what the difference is between Mr. Hayes and most people in this store? He's here buying diapers for his daughter instead of judgment for strangers. I'd say that makes him a better man than most." The businessman's face turned red, and he mumbled something about being in a hurry before practically fleeing the store. The other customers suddenly found their phones or their shoes incredibly interesting, the uncomfortable silence stretching until the credit card machine beeped its approval. "Here you go," Ashley said, handing Clara the receipt, along with 2 bags, one containing Clara's expensive groceries, the other filled with everything Lila needed. The teenager's attitude had completely changed. She was now looking at Clara with something approaching reverence. Clara took both bags and turned to Daniel, who stood frozen in place, struggling with a mixture of gratitude and humiliation that threatened to overwhelm him. She held out the bag containing the diapers and supplies. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly, "there's no shame in accepting help when it's freely given. The shame is in letting pride hurt the people we love." Daniel's hand shook as he reached for the bag. When their fingers brushed, he felt something he couldn't quite name, a connection that went beyond this moment, this store, this act of kindness. It was as if some part of him recognized her, though he was certain they'd never met before. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. You don't know me. You don't know my story. Why would you do this? Clara was quiet for a long moment, her silver eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of old pain that caught him off guard. Because I've been where you are, she said simply. Maybe not exactly, but close enough. I know what it's like to count pennies and come up short. I know what it's like to be judged by people who have never faced real hardship. And I know what it's like to love someone so much that you'd rather go without than see them suffer. She glanced at Lila, who was now reaching toward Clara with chubby arms, babbling happily. How old is she? 18 months, Daniel answered automatically. Her birthday was last week. I wanted to get her something special, but... He trailed off, embarrassed by his admission. What happened to her mother? Clara asked gently. If you don't mind me asking. Daniel's jaw tightened, the familiar pain of loss washing over him. Cancer, he said simply. 2 years ago. The treatments. They bankrupted us. And then she was gone and I was left with medical bills and a baby, and no idea how to keep it all together. Clara nodded slowly, understanding, flickering in her eyes. I'm sorry, she said, and Daniel could tell she meant it. That must have been incredibly difficult. We're managing, Daniel said, though even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. I work at Tony's auto repair during the day, and I clean offices at night. It's not much, but it's honest work. 2 jobs, Clara observed. When do you sleep? Daniel shrugged. When I can. Lila's a good baby. She sleeps pretty well considering. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Lila chose that moment to let out a wail that echoed through the small store. Daniel immediately reached for her, his movements automatic and practiced. He lifted her from the cart and held her against his chest, swaying slightly and murmuring soothing words. Hey, princess, he whispered, his voice transforming completely as he spoke to his daughter. Gone was the defensive edge, the weariness, the shame. In its place was pure, unconditional love. I know, sweetheart. Daddy knows. We're going to get you home and changed and fed okay. Everything's going to be all right. Clara watched this transformation with fascination. This was a different man from the one who had stood defeated at the checkout counter moments before. This was a father pure and simple, and the love he felt for his daughter radiated from him like warmth from a fire. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. She's lucky to have you, Clara said softly. Daniel looked up, surprised by the comment. I'm not so sure about that. If I was a better father, a better provider, she wouldn't have to go without things. She deserves better than this. She deserves love, Clara corrected firmly. Everything else is just details, and from what I can see, she has that in abundance. They stood there for a moment, an unlikely pair in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the corner store. Clara in her expensive coat and designer shoes, Daniel in his work clothes with his daughter in his arms. Around them, the normal sounds of commerce continued, the hum of refrigerators, the distant beep of scanners, the rustle of plastic bags. But in their small bubble, something significant was happening. A connection was forming, fragile as spun glass, but somehow unbreakable. I have to ask, Daniel said, finally shifting Lila to his other arm. Why did you really do this? I mean, I'm grateful, more grateful than I can express. But people like you don't usually, well, you don't usually notice people like me. Clara's expression darkened slightly, and for a moment Daniel caught a glimpse of something haunted in those silver eyes. You might be surprised, she said quietly. I notice more than you think. Before Daniel could ask what she meant, Clara glanced at her watch, a delicate piece that probably cost more than Daniel's car, and sighed. "I should go," she said. "I have a conference call with Tokyo in an hour." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back. "Mr. Hayes, Daniel, take care of yourself too. Lila needs her father healthy and whole. Don't forget that." "Wait!" Daniel called out as she reached the door. "How can I pay you back? I don't have much now, but I'm working towards something better. I could—" Clara turned back with a smile that transformed her entire face. For a moment, the careful mask of control slipped, and Daniel saw something vulnerable underneath. "Just take good care of that little girl," she said. "That's payment enough." And then she was gone, disappearing into the night, like some kind of guardian angel, leaving Daniel standing in the fluorescent glare with a bag full of supplies he desperately needed and a head full of questions he couldn't answer. The drive home to their small apartment was quiet except for Lila's contented babbling from her car seat. Daniel's mind kept returning to the encounter, trying to make sense of what had happened. Clara Monroe, he'd heard that name before, though he couldn't place where. Something about her had felt familiar, but that was impossible. People like her didn't move in the same circles as people like him. Their apartment was on the third floor of a converted house in one of the city's less desirable neighborhoods. It wasn't much a bedroom, a small living area, and a kitchenette, but it was clean and safe, and Daniel had managed to make it feel like home for Lila. He'd painted cartoon characters on the walls of her corner of the bedroom, built her a crib from scratch when he couldn't afford to buy one, and arranged her few toys with the same care he'd once used to design custom homes. As he changed Lila's diaper, one of the new ones Clara had bought Daniel, found himself thinking about the woman's parting words. "Take care of yourself, too." When was the last time someone had expressed concern for his well-being? Since Sarah's death, his entire existence had revolved around Lila's needs. He ate when she ate, slept when she slept, lived for her smiles, and worried about her tears. The idea that he mattered as an individual, separate from his role as her father, was almost foreign to him now. "What do you think, Princess?" he asked Lila as he snapped up her pajamas. "Was that lady an angel? Because I'm starting to think maybe she was." Lila responded with a giggle and a grab for his nose, her earlier fussiness forgotten, now that she was clean and comfortable. Daniel scooped her up and carried her to the small window that looked out over the street. 3 stories below the city hummed with its usual nighttime energy sirens in the distance, the rumble of late buses, the occasional shout from the bar on the corner. "One day," Daniel whispered to his daughter, "we're going to have something better than this. I promise you that. I don't know how yet, but we will. You're going to have everything you need, everything you deserve. Daddy's going to make sure of it." As he spoke the words, Daniel felt a familiar determination settling in his chest. Tomorrow he would start looking for a third job. Maybe something on weekends, when Mrs. Rodriguez from next door could watch Lila. He would study harder for his GED, maybe look into community college classes. He would find a way to climb out of this hole, not just for himself, but for the little girl who trusted him completely to make everything right. But tonight, as he rocked Lila to sleep and listened to her gentle breathing, Daniel allowed himself to feel grateful for the unexpected kindness of a stranger. Clara Monroe had given him more than diapers and baby food. She had given him dignity in a moment when he had almost lost it completely. She had seen him as a person worthy of respect, not just as a problem to be solved or ignored. As sleep finally claimed him in the chair beside Lila's crib, Daniel's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude for guardian angels who appeared in corner stores when you needed them most. He had no way of knowing that his encounter with Clara Monroe was far from over, or that the threads of their connection stretched back much further than either of them could imagine. Across the city, in a penthouse office overlooking the harbor, Clara Monroe stood at floor-to-ceiling windows and stared out at the lights below. The conference call with Tokyo had ended hours ago, but she hadn't left the office. She rarely did these days. Home was just another empty space filled with expensive things that meant nothing to anyone. The encounter at the corner store had shaken her more than she cared to admit. There had been something about Daniel Hayes, something in his eyes when he looked at his daughter, that had triggered memories she usually kept locked away. Memories of her own childhood of counting coins and coming up short of being judged by people who had never known real want or desperation. She thought about the way he had held his daughter, the fierce protectiveness in his voice when he spoke to her, the way his entire demeanor had changed when Lila was in his arms. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, that kind of pure, desperate love. Clara remembered feeling that way about someone once, long ago, before the world had taught her that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Pulling out her phone, Clara found herself typing Daniel's name into a search engine. She told herself it was just professional curiosity, due diligence, the kind of background check she ran on anyone who crossed her path. But as the results populated, she felt a growing sense of unease. Daniel Hayes, 32 years old, married to Sarah Elena Hayes, deceased, father to Lila Marie Hayes, previous owner of Hayes Construction, dissolved following bankruptcy proceedings 2 years prior. Current employment at Tony's Auto Repair and Sparkle Clean Janitorial Services. The bare facts of his life laid out in black and white, but they told only part of the story. They didn't capture the love in his voice when he spoke to his daughter, or the dignity with which he had faced his humiliation in the store. They didn't show the strength it must have taken to rebuild his life from nothing, or the courage required to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. Clara closed the browser and set her phone aside. She had done her good deed for the day. There was no reason to think about Daniel Hayes any further. But as she finally gathered her things to leave the office, she found herself hoping that he and Lila were sleeping peacefully in whatever small space they called home. And despite her best efforts to forget, she knew she would be thinking about them again tomorrow. In the distance, the city's clock tower chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. Neither Clara nor Daniel could have imagined that their brief encounter in Miller's corner store was just the first note in a symphony that would transform both of their lives in ways they never could have predicted. But sometimes the most important moments begin with the smallest gestures, a stranger's kindness, a father's love, and the mysterious way that broken souls recognize each other across the crowded spaces of the world. The night was far from over, and their story had only just begun. 3 weeks passed before their paths crossed again, and when they did, it was in a place that would have seemed impossible to predict. Daniel was on his knees beneath the hood of a battered delivery van in the parking lot of the Riverside Community Center, his hands black with grease and his back aching from the awkward angle. The van belonged to the food bank that operated out of the center's basement, and its transmission had given up the ghost at the worst possible moment right before their monthly distribution to families in need. "Tony said, you might be able to work some magic on this old beast," called a voice from behind him. Daniel recognized Father Miguel's heavily accented English without looking up. The elderly priest ran the community center with the kind of gentle determination that made even the most hardened skeptics believe in miracles. "I can try, Father," Daniel replied, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. "But I have to warn you, this transmission is held together with prayer and duct tape. I'm not sure even St. Christopher could get this thing running again." Father Miguel chuckled. "Well, we have plenty of prayer around here, and I think I saw some duct tape in the supply closet." Daniel was about to respond when the sound of expensive heels on asphalt made him look up. The sight that greeted him nearly caused him to drop his wrench. Clara Monroe was walking across the parking lot toward them, dressed in a crisp white blouse and navy blazer that somehow managed to look both professional and approachable. Her platinum hair caught the afternoon sunlight like spun silver, and those unforgettable pale blue eyes were scanning the scene with obvious familiarity. "Good afternoon, Father Miguel," she said, warmly embracing the priest with genuine affection. "How are Maria and the grandchildren? Growing like weeds and twice as beautiful." Father Miguel beamed. "Clara, I'd like you to meet Daniel Hayes. He's trying to resurrect our poor van here. Daniel, this is Clara Monroe. She's been a blessing to our community for years." Daniel slowly stood up, acutely aware of the grease stains on his clothes and the sweat on his forehead. Clara's eyes widened slightly as she recognized him, but her expression remained carefully neutral. "Mr. Hayes," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "What a pleasant surprise." "Ms. Monroe?" Daniel replied hastily, wiping his hand on his rag before accepting hers. The contact sent the same strange jolt of recognition through him that he'd felt in the store. "I didn't realize that you were involved with the community center. Clara has been our guardian angel for almost 5 years now," Father Miguel said proudly. "The new computers in the children's center, the renovated kitchen, the scholarship program, none of it would have been possible without her generosity." Daniel felt a familiar flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. Of course she was a philanthropist. Of course she spent her time helping the less fortunate. It made his encounter with her in the corner store even more mortifying. In retrospect, she probably saw him as just another charity case, another broken soul to add to her collection of good deeds. "It's nothing special," Clara said quickly, seeming to sense his discomfort. "The center does important work in the community. I'm just happy to support it however I can." "Don't let her fool you," Father Miguel continued, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension. "Last Christmas, she personally delivered presents to every child in our after-school program. Stayed until midnight wrapping gifts in the back room." "Father, please," Clara said, her cheeks coloring slightly. "Mr. Hayes doesn't need to hear about—" "Actually, I'd love to hear more," Daniel interrupted, surprised by his own boldness. "It sounds like you do a lot for the community. That's really admirable." Their eyes met across the space between them, and Daniel saw something flicker in Clara's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of some kind. Before either of them could speak, Father Miguel clapped his hands together. "Well, this is wonderful. Clara Daniel here is one of the finest mechanics I've ever met. Fixed Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick last month, when every other shop in town said it was hopeless. And Daniel Clara knows more about running efficient operations than anyone I've encountered. Perhaps you two could put your heads together about this van situation." Daniel opened his mouth to protest that he was just a simple mechanic, hardly qualified to collaborate with someone of Clara's obvious stature, but she spoke first. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked, moving closer to peer under the hood. Her expensive perfume mixed strangely with the smell of motor oil and hot metal. "Transmission's shot," Daniel explained, falling back into the comfortable rhythm of discussing something he actually understood. "The bands are worn out, the fluid's burnt, and I'm pretty sure the torque converter is seized. In a newer vehicle, you'd be looking at about $3,000 in repairs minimum." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "But this isn't a newer vehicle." "Exactly. This van's got over 200,000 miles on it, and honestly, even if we could afford to fix the transmission, something else would probably fail within the month. It's reached the end of its useful life." Father Miguel's face fell. "So we need a new van." "You need a new van," Daniel confirmed gently. "I'm sorry, Father. I know that's not what you wanted to hear." "The food bank serves over 300 families," Father Miguel said quietly. Without the van, we can't pick up donations from the grocery stores, can't deliver to the elderly, who can't make it here on their own. We'll have to suspend the program until we can figure something out." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Daniel knew what suspending the food bank program meant: families like his own going without children, going to bed hungry elderly people, choosing between medication and meals. The weight of it settled in his chest like a stone. "How much would a replacement van cost?" Clara asked. Father Miguel rubbed his forehead wearily. "A decent used one that could handle the workload. Probably 15,000–20,000. We've been saving, but we're only about halfway there, and with the roof repair last month." He shrugged helplessly. Daniel watched Clara's face as she processed this information. He could almost see the wheels turning behind those silver eyes, and he had a sudden, uncomfortable premonition about what she was thinking. "What if I told you I might have a solution?" she said slowly. "Clara, no," Father Miguel said immediately. "You've already done so much for us. We can't keep asking you to." "You're not asking," Clara interrupted firmly. "I'm offering, and it's not what you think." She turned to Daniel, and he felt caught in the intensity of her gaze. "Mr. Hayes, you said you work at an auto repair shop." "Tony's Auto Repair," Daniel confirmed warily. "Why? Does Tony handle fleet vehicles, delivery trucks, vans, that sort of thing?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Some. We service a few local companies." "Why do you ask?" Clara smiled, and Daniel felt his world tilt slightly off its axis. "Because I think I have a proposition that might benefit everyone involved." 2 hours later, Daniel found himself sitting in the passenger seat of Clara's sleek black sedan, heading toward the industrial district, where Monroe Industries' main distribution center was located. He still wasn't entirely sure how he'd ended up here one moment. He'd been explaining to Father Miguel that he'd try to keep the old van running for a few more weeks, and the next he was agreeing to Clara's mysterious proposition. "I should probably warn you," Clara said, as they pulled through the security gates of a massive warehouse complex. "This might seem a bit unconventional." "Unconventional how?" Daniel asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. Instead of answering directly, Clara parked in front of a building that could have housed a small aircraft. Through the open bay doors, Daniel could see rows upon rows of delivery vehicles, trucks, vans, and cargo vehicles of every size and description. Many of them bore the distinctive Monroe Industries logo, but others displayed the names of companies he'd never heard of. "Welcome to our fleet maintenance facility," Clara said, climbing out of the car. "We service not just our own vehicles, but those of several partner companies as well. It's a significant operation, over 400 vehicles in regular rotation." Daniel followed her into the building, his eyes widening as he took in the scope of the operation. It was like Tony's shop multiplied by 50, with hydraulic lifts, diagnostic equipment, and tools that probably cost more than most people's houses. Mechanics in crisp uniforms moved between the vehicles with practiced efficiency, and the whole place hummed with productive energy. "This is incredible," Daniel breathed. "I had no idea operations like this existed." "Most people don't," Clara agreed. "Fleet maintenance is invisible until something goes wrong, but it's absolutely critical to keeping commerce moving in this city." A tall man with graying hair approached them, wiping his hands on a shop towel. "Ms. Monroe," he said respectfully, "I wasn't expecting you today." "Hello, Frank," Clara replied warmly. "I want you to meet Daniel Hayes." "Daniel, this is Frank Rodriguez, our fleet operations manager." Frank extended a hand which Daniel shook automatically while trying to process what was happening. "Pleasure to meet you, Daniel. Any friend of Ms. Monroe's is welcome here." "Frank," Clara continued, "Daniel is an experienced mechanic who works at Tony's Auto Repair. I was hoping you might show him around, let him see how we operate here." Frank's eyes lit up with interest. "Tony Castellano's place, I know Tony, good man, runs a solid shop. What's your specialty, Daniel?" "General repair, mostly," Daniel replied, still feeling off balance. "Transmissions, engines, electrical systems. I worked construction for years before I got into automotive, so I'm pretty comfortable with hydraulics and heavy machinery too." "Construction?" Frank's eyebrows rose. "That's an interesting background. We could use someone with that kind of versatility." Daniel glanced at Clara, beginning to understand the direction this conversation was heading. "Ms. Monroe, I appreciate whatever you're trying to do here, but—" "Just listen," Clara said quietly. "Please." Frank was already warming to his subject. "See, we've been looking to expand our team," he explained, gesturing toward the bustling workshop. "Business has been growing faster than we can keep up with, and we need mechanics who can handle not just routine maintenance but complex diagnostics and repair work. The pay is competitive, full benefits, and there's real opportunity for advancement." "How competitive?" Daniel found himself asking, despite his reservations. "Starting salary would be around $55,000, Frank said casually, plus overtime opportunities which can add another $10,000 to $15,000 annually. Health insurance, dental vision, retirement matching. And we have an on-site daycare facility for employees with children." Daniel's head spun. $55,000 was more than double what he was making at his two current jobs combined. With benefits like that, he could actually provide for Lila the way she deserved. He could afford a better apartment, maybe even start saving for her college education. "What's the catch?" he asked suspiciously. "This seems too good to be true." Frank laughed. "No catch. Well, except that you'd be working for the most demanding boss in the city." He glanced at Clara with obvious affection. "Ms. Monroe expects excellence from everyone on her team, but she also rewards it fairly. This place has the lowest turnover rate of any fleet operation in the state." "Frank, you're embarrassing me," Clara said, but Daniel could see she was pleased by the compliment. "It's true," Frank insisted. "I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've never worked anywhere that treated its people better. We invest in our employees because we know they're our most valuable asset." They spent the next hour touring the facility, and Daniel found himself increasingly impressed despite his skepticism. The equipment was state-of-the-art, the work environment was clean and well-organized, and the other mechanics he met seemed genuinely happy to be there. It was everything Tony's shop wasn't modern, efficient, and professionally run. But it was also intimidating. Daniel had never worked for a large corporation, before never been part of anything this sophisticated and organized. He was used to the informal atmosphere of Tony's shop, where decisions were made over coffee and problems were solved with ingenuity rather than expensive diagnostic equipment. "So what do you think?" Clara asked as they walked back toward her car. "Does it seem like something you might be interested in?" Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her. "Why are you doing this? And please don't tell me it's because you believe in helping people or supporting the community. This feels personal somehow." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her silver eyes studying his face with that same intensity he'd noticed in the store. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard it before. "Do you remember what you said to your daughter that night in the store when she was crying?" The question caught Daniel off guard. "I said a lot of things. She was upset, and I was trying to calm her down." "You told her that everything was going to be all right," Clara said quietly. "You promised her that Daddy would take care of everything, that she didn't need to worry." Daniel nodded slowly, unsure where this was leading. "I believed you," Clara continued. Standing there in that store watching you with her, I believed every word you said. You weren't just trying to comfort a crying baby, you were making a sacred promise. And I could see in your eyes that you would move mountains to keep that promise if you had to. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. I've built my business by recognizing potential in people, Daniel. By seeing past the surface to what someone is truly capable of achieving. And when I look at you, I see someone with the kind of character and determination that can't be taught. Those are the people I want on my team. But the timing, Daniel began. The timing is what it is, Clara interrupted. I've been looking for the right person to join Frank's team for months. The fact that you also happen to be someone who could benefit from the opportunity doesn't make it charity. It makes it smart business. Daniel considered this, weighing his natural suspicion against the genuine opportunity being presented. What about Tony? I can't just abandon him without notice. He's been good to me even when times were tough. I wouldn't expect you to, Clara replied. A 2-week notice is standard, and we can work around whatever timeline makes sense for you and Tony. And the community center van? Clara smiled. Already taken care of. Monroe Industries donates several vehicles to local charities every year when we cycle out our fleet. Father Miguel will have a replacement van by the end of the week. Daniel shook his head in amazement. You had this all planned out, didn't you? I had contingencies prepared, Clara admitted. But the final decision is entirely yours. I won't pressure you, and there won't be any hard feelings if you decide this isn't right for you. They had reached her car, but neither of them moved to get in. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and Daniel found himself at a crossroads that would define not just his immediate future, but Lila's as well. Can I ask you something? He said finally. Of course. That night in the store you said you'd been where I was. What did you mean by that? Clara's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. For a moment Daniel thought she might not answer. When she did speak, her voice carried a weight of old pain that surprised him. I grew up in foster care, she said simply. Bounced between homes from the time I was 6 until I aged out of the system at 18. I know what it's like to count pennies and come up short. I know what it's like to be judged by people who've never known real hardship. And I know what it's like to love someone so much that you'd rather go without than see them suffer. The honesty of her admission hit Daniel like a physical blow. He had assumed, like most people probably did, that Clara Monroe had been born into wealth and privilege. The idea that she had clawed her way up from nothing, that she understood his struggles from personal experience, changed everything. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't know. Very few people do, Clara replied. It's not something I advertise, but I've never forgotten what it felt like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of other people's kindness or indifference. That's why I do what I do, not out of guilt or obligation, but because I remember. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who had found unexpected common ground in the shared experience of struggle and survival. Finally, Daniel took a deep breath and made his decision. When would you need an answer? He asked. Take your time, Clara said. This is a big decision, and you should think it through carefully. Talk it over with Tony, maybe visit the facility again when you can spend more time with the team. Actually, Daniel said, surprising himself with his certainty, I don't need more time. If the offer is genuine, if this is really about my qualifications and not about charity, then yes, I'd like to accept the position. Clara's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Are you sure you don't want to think about it overnight? I've been thinking about it since the moment Frank mentioned the salary, Daniel admitted with a rueful smile. This is exactly the kind of opportunity I've been praying for. The chance to provide for Lila the way she deserves to build something stable for our future. I'd be crazy to turn it down. Then welcome to Monroe Industries, Clara said, extending her hand formally. I think you're going to fit in very well here. As they shook hands, Daniel felt that same jolt of connection he'd experienced before, but this time it felt different, less like recognition and more like possibility. Like the first note of a song he was about to learn by heart. There is one condition, Clara said, as they finally got into the car. Something I need you to understand before you start. Daniel's stomach clenched. Here it comes, he thought. The catch that Frank said didn't exist. What kind of condition? I need you to promise me that you won't let pride get in the way of asking for help if you need it, Clara said seriously. I've seen too many good people struggle unnecessarily because they were afraid to admit they needed support. If you run into problems, personal or professional, I want you to know that you can come to me. Daniel was quiet for a moment, processing this unexpected request. You're asking me to trust you. I'm asking you to let me be your friend, Clara corrected gently. I know that's presumptuous given how recently we met, but I have a feeling that we're going to be in each other's lives for a long time to come. As they drove back toward the city center, Daniel found himself thinking about the strange series of coincidences that had led to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he had been a man at the end of his rope, defeated by circumstances beyond his control. Tonight he was driving home to tell Lila that their lives were about to change in ways he never could have imagined. Can I ask you one more thing? He said, as Clara pulled up in front of the community center where he'd left his car. Always. How did you know I'd be here today, at the center, I mean? It seems like an awfully big coincidence. Clara smiled mysteriously. Father Miguel mentioned that someone was working on their van. When he described the Good Samaritan who was trying to help, it sounded familiar. I thought there was a chance it might be you. And if it hadn't been Kuang, then I would have met another person doing good work in the community, Clara said simply. Either way, it would have been time well spent. As Daniel got out of the car, Clara rolled down her window. Daniel, take this opportunity and run with it. You deserve good things, and so does Lila. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise. Driving home in his battered Honda, Daniel felt a lightness in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since Sarah's death, the future looked bright with possibility rather than dark with uncertainty. He thought about Clara's words, about deserving good things, and found himself believing them in a way that surprised him. When he picked up Lila from Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment, his elderly neighbor immediately noticed the change in his demeanor. You look different tonight, mijo, she said, bouncing Lila on her hip. Something good happened. Something very good. Daniel confirmed, taking his daughter and holding her close. How would you like it if Daddy had a new job, Princess One, that paid enough for us to get a bigger place, maybe with a yard where you can play? Lila gurgled happily and grabbed at his nose, oblivious to the magnitude of the changes coming to their lives. But Daniel could see it all stretching out before them, a future where he could provide for his daughter with dignity, where he could build the kind of life Sarah had dreamed of for their family. As he prepared Lila for bed that night, singing the same lullabies he'd sung since she was born, Daniel found himself thinking about Clara Monroe and the unexpected gift of her friendship. She had seen something in him that he had almost forgotten existed, potential, worth the capacity for something greater than mere survival. Tomorrow he would give Tony his notice. Next week he would start a new chapter of his life. But tonight, he simply held his daughter close and whispered promises he finally believed he could keep. The darkness that had surrounded them for so long was beginning to give way to dawn, and Daniel Hayes was ready to step into the light. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the doorway of their new apartment, watching Lila take wobbly steps across the hardwood floor of what was now her playroom. The two-bedroom place in Riverside Gardens wasn't luxurious by any stretch, but it was clean, safe, and had the kind of natural light that made everything feel hopeful. Most importantly, it had a small yard where Lila could play once she mastered the art of walking. "Look at you go, princess," Daniel said softly, crouching down with his arms outstretched. "Come to daddy." Lila giggled and took 3 determined steps before tumbling into his arms, her face bright with triumph. Daniel swept her up and spun her around, both of them laughing, as afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows. These moments had become precious to him, unhurried time with his daughter, Praro, from the constant anxiety about money that had once colored every interaction. The transition to Monroe Industries had been smoother than Daniel had dared to hope. Frank Rodriguez had proven to be an excellent mentor, patiently teaching him the sophisticated diagnostic systems and introducing him to the complexities of fleet management. The other mechanics had welcomed him warmly, and Daniel found himself part of a team that took genuine pride in their work. More surprisingly, he had discovered an aptitude for the business side of operations that he never knew he possessed. His construction background had given him insights into project management and resource allocation that translated well to fleet maintenance. Within 3 months, Frank had begun involving him in scheduling decisions and vendor negotiations. But perhaps the most unexpected development had been his growing friendship with Clara. She had made good on her promise to be available if he needed support, but their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. She would stop by the shop occasionally, ostensibly to check on operations, but really to see how he was settling in. Sometimes she would bring coffee for the team or pastries from the expensive bakery downtown. Other times, she would simply appear in the break room, asking Frank about scheduling challenges or equipment needs with the kind of detailed attention that made it clear she genuinely cared about the operation. Daniel had noticed that these visits often coincided with times when he was feeling overwhelmed or uncertain. It was as if Clara had developed some kind of sixth sense about when he needed encouragement. She never made a big production of it, never drew attention to her concern. But somehow she always seemed to know when to show up with exactly the right words or gesture to help him remember why he belonged there. The sound of his phone buzzing interrupted his thoughts. Clara's name appeared on the screen, and Daniel felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that accompanied her calls. "Hey," he answered, settling onto the couch with Lila in his lap. "How's the conference going?" Clara was in Chicago for a week-long industry symposium, and Daniel was surprised by how much he missed their casual interactions. Over the past few months, she had become a constant presence in his life, not intrusive but reliable in a way that reminded him of the stability he'd once shared with Sarah. "Boring." Clara's voice came through the speaker, tinged with exhaustion. "Endless panels about supply chain optimization and sustainability initiatives. I swear, if I have to sit through one more presentation about carbon footprint reduction, I might lose my mind." Daniel laughed. "Rough life being a corporate mogul." "Mock me all you want," Clara replied, but he could hear the smile in her voice. "How's my favorite mechanic doing? And more importantly, how's Lila?" "We're good," Daniel said, watching his daughter play with her blocks on the coffee table. "She took her first real steps today, made it almost across the room before she fell down." "Daniel, that's wonderful." Clara's excitement was genuine and immediate. "Did you get it on video?" "Of course. What kind of father do you think I am?" "The best kind," Clara said softly, and something in her tone made Daniel pause. There was a loneliness in those 3 words that caught him off guard. Clara, you okay? A long silence followed, broken only by the distant sounds of hotel activity in the background. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Can I tell you something? Something I've never told anyone else. Daniel's chest tightened with concern. In all their conversations over the past 6 months, Clara had remained largely private about her personal life. She asked endless questions about Lila, seemed genuinely interested in Daniel's hopes and fears, but rarely shared anything deeply personal about herself, beyond the basic facts of her childhood in foster care. Of course, he said. You can tell me anything. I always wanted children, Clara said quietly. When I was young, I used to imagine what it would be like to have a family of my own. A real family, not the rotating cast of foster parents and social workers that made up my childhood. I thought that once I built something stable, once I had enough money and security, I would find someone and start a family. Daniel waited, sensing there was more. But somewhere along the way, building the business became everything, Clara continued. I told myself I was just waiting for the right time, the right person. Then suddenly I was 35, then 40, and I realized I had let the dream slip away while I was focused on other things. Now I'm 43 and I watch you with Lila, and I see what I gave up without even realizing it. The raw honesty of her admission hit Daniel like a physical blow. He thought about all the times Clara had watched him interact with Lila, the way her face would soften when she saw them together, the genuine joy she took in hearing about Lila's milestones and achievements. What he had interpreted as simple kindness was actually something much more complex, a woman watching from the outside the life she had always wanted, but never allowed herself to have. Clara, he said gently, it's not too late. You're an amazing woman, successful, kind, beautiful. Any man would be lucky to build a life with you. Would he? Clara's laugh was bitter. Do you know what my typical day looks like, Daniel? I'm in the office by 6:30 in the morning and rarely leave before 8 at night. I work most weekends. My last relationship ended 3 years ago because I missed his birthday dinner for a board meeting. The man before that told me I was emotionally unavailable and married to my work. He wasn't wrong. Daniel found himself struggling for the right words. The successful, confident woman he had come to know seemed so different from the lonely, regretful person on the other end of the phone. Maybe, he said carefully, the right person would understand your work would support your ambitions instead of competing with them. Maybe, Clara agreed, but she didn't sound convinced. Or maybe I've become too set in my ways, too independent. Maybe I've forgotten how to let someone else matter more than quarterly earnings reports and market share analysis. Before Daniel could respond, Lila began fussing, reaching for the phone with chubby hands. The interruption seemed to break the spell of intimate conversation, and when Clara spoke again, her voice had returned to its usual composed tone. I should let you go, she said. Lila sounds like she needs your attention. Clara, wait. I'll see you when I get back on Friday, she interrupted. Give Lila a kiss from me. The line went dead, leaving Daniel staring at his phone with a mixture of concern and confusion. The conversation had revealed a side of Clara he had never seen before, vulnerable, uncertain, deeply lonely, despite all her success. It also raised questions about the nature of their friendship that he wasn't entirely comfortable examining too closely. The truth was, Daniel's feelings about Clara had become increasingly complicated over the past few months. What had started as gratitude for her kindness had evolved into genuine affection and respect. He looked forward to her visits to the shop, found himself thinking about their conversations long after they ended, and felt a warmth in her presence that he hadn't experienced with anyone since Sarah. But acknowledging those feelings felt like a betrayal of his wife's memory, even though she had been gone for over 2 years. More than that, it felt presumptuous to imagine that someone like Clara Monroe, wealthy, sophisticated, accomplished, could see him as anything more than a project, a good deed to feel proud of. The internal conflict had been building for weeks, coming to a head the previous month, when Clara had stayed late at the shop to help him diagnose a particularly stubborn transmission problem. They had worked side by side for hours, their easy collaboration peppered with laughter and gentle teasing. When they finally solved the problem, Clara had impulsively hugged him in celebration, and for a moment, they had stood frozen in each other's arms, the air between them electric with possibility. Then, reality had crashed back in, and they had pulled apart awkwardly, both pretending the moment hadn't happened. Clara had left immediately afterward, claiming she had early meetings the next day, and Daniel had spent the rest of the night questioning everything he thought he understood about their relationship. Now listening to Clara's lonely confession from a hotel room in Chicago, Daniel felt the careful barriers he had constructed around his heart beginning to crack. She wasn't just the successful businesswoman who had rescued him from poverty. She was a woman who had sacrificed personal happiness for professional achievement and was only now beginning to realize the cost of that choice. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself thinking constantly about Clara's words. He noticed things he had overlooked before, the way she lingered after their conversations, as if reluctant to return to an empty office or an empty home. The careful way she always asked permission before picking up Lila, as if afraid she might be overstepping boundaries. The wistful expression that crossed her face when she watched him perform the mundane tasks of fatherhood, changing diapers, preparing bottles, singing lullabies. By Thursday evening, Daniel had made a decision. He was going to cook dinner for Clara when she returned from Chicago, nothing fancy, just a simple meal shared in the comfort of his home with Lila. It would be his way of showing her that she wasn't as alone as she believed, that there were people who cared about her beyond her business acumen and charitable contributions. But fate, as it had a tendency to do, intervened with a crisis that would test everything Daniel thought he understood about himself, about Clara, and about the fragile bond that had been growing between them. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made even optimists feel melancholy. Daniel was at work early reviewing the maintenance schedule for the weekend when Frank approached with a concerned expression. "Daniel, I need you to take a look at something," Frank said, leading him toward one of the newer delivery trucks. "This came in yesterday afternoon with some kind of electrical problem. The driver said the dashboard lights were going crazy and now it won't start at all." Daniel popped the hood and began his diagnostic routine. But within minutes, he realized this was unlike any electrical problem he had encountered before. The wiring harness had been deliberately damaged, cut in specific places that would cause maximum disruption while appearing accidental at first glance. "Frank," Daniel called, his voice tight with concern. "This isn't a mechanical failure. Someone sabotaged this truck." Frank's face went pale. "Are you sure?" "Positive. Look at these cuts. They're too clean, too precise to be accidental. And the pattern of damage is designed to disable the vehicle without making it immediately obvious what happened." Before Frank could respond, Daniel's phone rang. Clara's name appeared on the screen, but when he answered, her voice was strained and urgent. "Daniel, thank God. I need you to listen to me very carefully. There's been a security breach at the facility. Someone broke into the office building last night and accessed our computer systems." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What kind of breach?" "We're not sure yet, but it looks like they were specifically targeting employee records and operational data. The police are involved, and we're conducting a full security audit." Clara paused, and Daniel could hear voices in the background. "I'm flying back this morning instead of this afternoon. Can you meet me at the office around noon?" "Of course," Daniel said automatically, then hesitated. Clara, I think the security breach might be connected to something here at the shop. We found evidence of sabotage on one of the trucks. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Sabotage. Clara's voice was deadly quiet. Someone deliberately damaged the electrical system to disable the vehicle. It was made to look like a mechanical failure, but it was definitely intentional. Daniel, I want you to shut down all operations immediately, Clara said, her executive authority cutting through the fear in her voice. Don't let anyone touch any of the vehicles until the police and our security team can examine everything. This is bigger than we thought. The next few hours passed in a blur of police interviews, security sweeps, and tense conversations with investigators. By the time Clara arrived at the facility accompanied by a team of corporate security specialists, the scope of the problem had become clear. Someone with inside knowledge of Monroe Industries had orchestrated a coordinated attack designed to cripple their fleet operations while stealing sensitive data about their clients and contracts. Daniel watched Clara command the crisis response with impressive calm and efficiency, but he could see the strain in the tight line of her shoulders, the controlled fury in her pale blue eyes. This wasn't just an attack on her business. It was a personal violation, a betrayal by someone she had trusted, Ms. Monroe. The lead investigator, a grizzled detective named Morrison, approached Clara as she finished reviewing security footage. We're going to need to interview all your employees, starting with anyone who had access to both the computer systems and the maintenance facility. Clara nodded grimly. Of course. Whatever you need. We'll also need to examine the personnel files for anyone who's been hired in the past year, Morrison continued. Sometimes these operations involve planting someone inside the organization months in advance. Daniel felt his stomach drop. As one of the most recent hires, he would obviously be high on the list of suspects. The irony was crushing just when he had begun to build a stable life for himself and Lila. Just when he had started to believe in the possibility of a future with Clara, everything was about to come crashing down. As if reading his thoughts, Morrison turned to him next. Mr. Hayes, I understand you were the one who discovered the sabotage. That's right, Daniel replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Convenient, Morrison observed with the flat skepticism of a man who had seen too many inside jobs. Tell me, how long have you been working here? 6 months. Daniel answered, acutely aware of Clara watching the exchange with growing alarm. And before that, I worked at Tony's Auto Repair for about 2 years. And before that, I ran my own construction company until it went bankrupt. Morrison made notes on his pad. Financial difficulties, then. That's often a motive for this kind of operation. Detective Morrison, Clara interrupted sharply. Mr. Hayes is the one who alerted us to the sabotage. If he were involved, why would he call attention to his own work? Morrison shrugged. Could be a way to deflect suspicion. Or maybe he got cold feet. It happens more often than you'd think. Daniel felt the familiar heat of humiliation rising in his chest. Here it was again, the assumption that his poverty made him inherently untrustworthy, that his struggles with money automatically made him a suspect. He saw his coworkers watching the exchange with expressions ranging from sympathy to suspicion, and he knew that regardless of the investigation's outcome, his reputation at Monroe Industries was irreparably damaged. Detective, he said quietly, I understand you have to investigate everyone and I'll cooperate fully. But I want you to know that Ms. Monroe saved my life when she gave me this job. The last thing I would ever do is betray her trust or put this company at risk. Morrison's expression remained skeptical, but he nodded. We'll see. Don't leave town while the investigation is ongoing. As the detective moved on to interview other employees, Daniel found himself alone with Clara for the first time since the crisis began. She looked exhausted, her usually perfect composure frayed at the edges, and Daniel's heart ached for her. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I know this is the last thing you needed to deal with." Clara looked at him with genuine confusion. "Why are you apologizing? You're the one who uncovered the sabotage. If you hadn't noticed the pattern of damage, we might not have realized this was an inside job until it was too late." "Because I know how this looks," Daniel replied. "The poor guy with the criminal record." "You don't have a criminal record," Clara interrupted. "No, but I have a bankruptcy, a dead wife, and a history of financial problems. I'm exactly the kind of person these investigators assume would be vulnerable to bribes or coercion." Clara stepped closer, her silver eyes blazing with an intensity that took Daniel's breath away. "Don't you dare diminish yourself like that," she said fiercely. "I know you, Daniel Hayes. I know your character, your integrity, your loyalty. The idea that you would be involved in something like this is so absurd, it's almost insulting." Her absolute faith in him was overwhelming. After years of being judged and dismissed based on his circumstances, rather than his character, having someone believe in him so completely felt like a gift he wasn't sure he deserved. "What if the investigation takes weeks?" Daniel asked. "What if they can't find the real culprit, and I remain under suspicion? You can't afford to keep an employee that people don't trust." "Then I guess we'll have to find the real culprit," Clara said with grim determination. "Because I'm not losing you over this. You're too important to—" She stopped abruptly, as if she'd said more than she intended. "Important to the operation," Daniel finished, though he couldn't shake the feeling that wasn't what she had started to say. "Yes," Clara agreed, but her eyes told a different story. "Important to the operation." The rest of the day passed in a haze of interviews, evidence collection, and tense speculation. By evening, the police had cleared the scene but left the facility under security watch until their investigation could be completed. Clara dismissed the employees who weren't directly involved in the crisis, but Daniel lingered reluctant to leave her alone to deal with the aftermath. "You should go home to Lila," Clara said, as they stood in the empty break room, the silence of the usually bustling facility feeling eerie and wrong. "What about you?" Daniel asked. "You look like you haven't slept in days." Clara rubbed her temples wearily. "I probably haven't. The Chicago conference was already exhausting, and now this. I'll be fine, I just need to review the security reports and make some calls to our insurance company." "Clara," Daniel said gently, "when's the last time you had a real meal, not conference food or whatever you grabbed from the vending machine here?" She looked up at him with surprise, as if the question hadn't occurred to her. "I don't know. Tuesday, maybe?" Without thinking, Daniel made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. "Come home with me." "What?" "Come home with me," he repeated, more confident now. "I'll cook dinner, nothing fancy, just something real and warm. Lila would love to see you, and you look like you could use some time away from all this." Clara stared at him as if he had suggested they fly to the moon. "Daniel, I can't. I have too much work to do, and you have your own life to worry about. You don't need to take care of me." "Maybe I want to," Daniel said softly. "Maybe I need to feel like there's something I can do to help instead of just standing around being a suspect in my own workplace." The honesty of his words seemed to break through Clara's defenses. Her carefully maintained composure cracked, and for a moment she looked utterly lost. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to let someone take care of me." "Then let me teach you," Daniel replied, extending his hand toward her. "Just for tonight. Let me show you what it feels like to come home to people who care about you." Clara looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, and Daniel could see her internal struggle playing out on her face. Finally, slowly, she reached out and took his hand, allowing him to lead her away from the chaos of her professional life and into the uncertain territory of something that felt dangerously close to hope. As they walked toward the parking lot together, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this moment marked a turning point in their relationship. The crisis had stripped away the careful boundaries they had maintained, forcing them to confront the depth of their connection. Whatever happened with the investigation, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to love someone again. The drive to Daniel's apartment passed in comfortable silence, Clara following his battered Honda in her sleek sedan through the tree-lined streets of Riverside Gardens. Daniel kept glancing in his rearview mirror, half expecting her to change her mind and turn around, but she stayed with him all the way to the parking lot. When they both stepped out of their cars, the contrast between their vehicles seemed to symbolize everything that separated their worlds, yet somehow, in this moment, those differences felt less important than the connection that had brought them here. "This is it," Daniel said, gesturing toward the modest 3-story building. "Not exactly what you're used to, I imagine." Clara looked up at the building with genuine interest rather than judgment. "It's lovely," she said. "It feels like a real neighborhood, a place where people actually live instead of just existing." Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting at her door as they climbed the stairs, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar heels on the wooden steps. Her weathered face lit up with curiosity when she saw Clara, and Daniel could practically see the questions forming in her mind. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Daniel said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Clara Monroe. Clara, this is my neighbor and Lila's honorary grandmother, Mrs. Rodriguez." "Encantada," Mrs. Rodriguez said, extending a hand to Clara with the formal dignity she reserved for special occasions. "Daniel has mentioned you many times. You are the angel from his work, no?" Clara's cheeks colored slightly. "I wouldn't say angel, but yes, I work with Daniel. How is Lila this evening?" "Perfect as always," Mrs. Rodriguez beamed. "She ate all her dinner and played so nicely. She is waiting for her papa with much excitement." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Lila appeared in Mrs. Rodriguez's doorway, her face breaking into a huge smile when she saw Daniel. She toddled toward him on unsteady legs, babbling happily in her own private language. "There's my princess," Daniel said, scooping her up and covering her face with kisses. "Did you have a good day with Abuela Rodriguez?" Clara watched this reunion with an expression of such tender longing that Daniel felt his heart clench. When Lila noticed Clara and reached toward her with eager hands, Clara's face transformed completely. "Hello, beautiful girl," Clara said softly, accepting Lila into her arms with practiced ease. "I missed you while I was away." "She knows you," Mrs. Rodriguez observed with satisfaction. "Children, they have good instincts about people. They know who has a good heart." Daniel thanked Mrs. Rodriguez and led Clara into his apartment, suddenly seeing the space through her eyes. The furniture was second-hand, but clean and well-maintained. Lila's toys were organized in colorful bins, and Daniel's attempts at decoration. Family photos, Lila's artwork, a few plants that somehow managed to thrive. Despite his inconsistent care, gave the place a warmth that money couldn't buy. "It's perfect," Clara said, and Daniel could tell she meant it. "It feels like a home." "Can I get you something to drink?" Daniel asked, settling Lila in her high chair with some toys. "I've got coffee, tea, water, or—" He opened the refrigerator and winced. "Actually, that's about it. I wasn't exactly prepared for company." "Water is fine," Clara said, but she was already moving toward Lila, engaging the toddler in animated conversation. that consisted mostly of silly faces and exaggerated expressions that made Lila giggle with delight. Daniel found himself watching this interaction with growing amazement. The controlled professional, Clara he knew from work, had completely disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed to understand instinctively how to connect with a child. She wasn't performing for his benefit or trying to prove anything. She was simply being present with Lila in a way that was utterly natural and genuine. "You're good with her," Daniel observed, beginning to prepare dinner with ingredients he'd picked up earlier that week. "She's easy to be good with," Clara replied, helping Lila stack blocks. "She's such a happy little girl. You've done an incredible job raising her." "I've had a lot of help," Daniel said, thinking of Mrs. Rodriguez, Tony, Father Miguel, and all the other people who had formed a support network around them. "It takes a village, you know." "I wouldn't know," Clara said quietly, and Daniel heard the old pain in her voice again. He paused in his food preparation. "Clara, can I ask you something? Always. When you were in foster care, was there ever anyone who made you feel like family, even for a little while?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, her attention seemingly focused on helping Lila with her toys. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There was one family," she said. "The Hendersons. I was with them from age 12 to 14, the longest I ever stayed anywhere. They had 3 biological children, but they treated me like I belonged. Margaret Henderson used to braid my hair before school, and Robert taught me how to ride a bike in their driveway." Daniel waited, sensing there was more to the story. "I thought they might adopt me," Clara continued. "I started to believe that maybe I had found my forever family. Then Margaret got pregnant again, and suddenly there wasn't room for a foster child anymore. Back I went into the system." The casual way she recounted this devastating betrayal broke Daniel's heart. "Clara, I'm so sorry." "It wasn't their fault," Clara said quickly. "They had their own family to think about. I understand that now. But at the time, it felt like the end of the world. I decided then that I would never let myself depend on anyone else for my happiness or security. I would build my own life, my own success, and I would never again put myself in a position where someone could decide I didn't belong." Daniel turned from the stove to look at her directly. "Is that why you've never married, never had children?" Clara's laugh was hollow. "Partly. But also because I genuinely don't know how to do it, how to be part of a family, how to put someone else's needs before my own ambitions. I've been taking care of myself for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to take care of anyone else." "That's not true," Daniel said firmly. "Look at what you did for me for Lila. Look at everything you do for the community center for your employees. You take care of people all the time." "That's different," Clara protested. "That's business or charity. It's not intimate. It's not the kind of daily mundane care that real families require." Daniel set down his cooking utensils and moved to sit across from her at the small dining table. Lila, content with her toys, babbled quietly to herself in her high chair. "Clara, can I tell you what I see when I look at you with Lila?" She nodded hesitantly. "I see someone who remembers exactly what it felt like to be a child who needed love and protection. I see someone who instinctively knows how to make a little girl feel safe and cherished. I see someone who would fight tigers to protect the people she cares about." Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. "I see someone who would make an extraordinary mother." Tears welled in Clara's silver eyes, and she looked away quickly. "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't say things like that." "Why not if they're true? Because it hurts too much to hope for something that can never happen." Daniel reached across the table and gently took her hand. Who says it can never happen? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to voice. Clara stared at their joined hands, as if she couldn't quite believe they were real. "I'm 43 years old, Daniel," she said finally. "Even if I wanted to have children, even if I could figure out how to have a relationship that lasted longer than 6 months, the odds of getting pregnant naturally at my age are—" "There are other ways to have children," Daniel interrupted gently. "Adoption, surrogacy, fostering. You of all people should know that biology isn't what makes a family." Clara pulled her hand away and stood up abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the small courtyard. "You don't understand," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "It's not just about having children. It's about deserving them. It's about being the kind of person who can create a stable, loving home instead of the kind of person who puts quarterly earnings reports ahead of birthday parties." Daniel stood as well, moving to stand behind her. "Clara, look at me." She turned reluctantly, and Daniel was shocked by the vulnerability in her face. This was a woman who commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals, but right now she looked like the 12-year-old girl who had been told she didn't belong. "You are not your work," Daniel said firmly. "Yes, you're driven and ambitious and incredibly successful, but you're also kind and generous and fiercely protective of the people you care about. The fact that you've built something extraordinary from nothing doesn't disqualify you from having a personal life. It proves that you have the strength and determination to succeed at whatever you set your mind to." "What if I'm too broken?" Clara whispered. "What if 30 years of emotional self-protection has damaged me beyond repair?" Daniel studied her face, seeing past the fear to the hope she was trying so hard to suppress. "Then I guess you'll have to find someone patient enough to help you put the pieces back together." Their eyes met and held, and Daniel felt the same electric tension that had charged the air between them that night at the shop. But this time neither of them pulled away. This time Clara took a step closer, her silver eyes searching his face as if looking for answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "Daniel," she said softly, "what are we doing here?" Before he could answer, the smoke alarm began shrieking, and they both turned to see smoke pouring from the pan on the stove. Daniel rushed to turn off the burner and open windows, while Clara quickly moved Lila away from the chaos. Within minutes, the smoke had cleared, but dinner was ruined. "So much for my culinary skills," Daniel said ruefully, staring at the blackened remains of what was supposed to have been a simple pasta dish. Clara began laughing, a sound so genuine and uninhibited that it transformed her entire appearance. "I can't remember the last time someone nearly burned down their kitchen trying to cook for me," she said. "It's actually quite romantic in a disaster movie sort of way." "Romantic?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Is that what we're calling this?" Clara's laughter faded, but her smile remained. "I don't know what to call it," she admitted. "I don't have experience with whatever this is." "Then maybe we should figure it out together," Daniel suggested. "But first, we should probably find something else for dinner. There's a good pizza place that delivers—" "Actually," Clara interrupted, "I have a better idea. There's an excellent Italian restaurant about 10 minutes from here. Why don't we go out, all three of us?" Daniel hesitated. "Clara, taking Lila to a nice restaurant is an adventure," Clara finished. "Come on, when's the last time you had a proper dinner out? And don't say you can't afford it. This is my treat. I insist." 30 minutes later, they were seated at a corner table in Bella Vista, an upscale Italian restaurant that Daniel had driven past countless times, but never imagined entering. Lila sat in a high chair between them, contentedly munching on breadsticks, while Daniel and Clara perused menus that didn't list prices, always a bad sign in Daniel's experience. "Order whatever you want," Clara said, noticing his hesitation. "The osso buco is excellent, and their wine list is supposed to be one of the best in the city." "Clara, this place must cost—" "Daniel," she interrupted firmly. "Tonight you're not allowed to worry about money. Tonight you're just allowed to enjoy good food and good company. Can you do that for me?" Daniel looked around the elegant dining room, taking in the soft lighting, the crisp white tablecloths, the attentive servers moving efficiently between tables. A year ago, a place like this would have been completely outside his world. Now here he was sharing dinner with one of the most successful women in the city, while his daughter charmed the waitstaff with her infectious giggle. "I can try," he said finally. The meal that followed was unlike anything Daniel had experienced since Sarah's death. Clara proved to be an engaging conversationalist, moving easily between topics ranging from literature to travel to her early struggles building Monroe Industries. She seemed genuinely interested in Daniel's stories about his construction days, asking thoughtful questions about project management and client relationships that made him realize how much he missed the creative challenges of building something from nothing. More remarkable was the way she interacted with Lila. Clara cut the toddler's food into perfect bite-sized pieces, wiped her face with gentle efficiency, and kept up a steady stream of animated conversation that kept Lila engaged and happy throughout the entire meal. Other diners smiled indulgently at their table, clearly charmed by the sight of the elegant woman playing peekaboo with the giggling child. "You're a natural at this," Daniel observed as Clara helped Lila navigate a particularly challenging piece of pasta. "I used to babysit when I was in high school," Clara explained. "It was one of the few jobs I could get that paid cash under the table. I loved it. Those were some of the happiest moments of my teenage years, playing house with other people's children and pretending I knew what a real family felt like." "What was your first job out of high school?" Daniel asked. Clara's expression grew more serious. "Data entry at a small logistics company. $8 an hour, no benefits, and a boss who thought sexual harassment was a management technique. But it was a foot in the door, and I was determined to learn everything I could about the business." "How did you go from data entry to owning your own company?" "Very slowly and with a lot of 18-hour days," Clara replied. "I took night classes in business and accounting, saved every penny I could, and eventually convinced a bank to loan me enough money to buy a single delivery truck. I drove that truck myself for the first 2 years, making deliveries during the day and cold calling potential clients at night." Daniel shook his head in amazement. "That's incredible. You built an empire from nothing." "I built a business," Clara corrected. "The empire part happened later after I figured out how to scale operations and started acquiring smaller companies. But those early years, they were the hardest and in some ways the most rewarding of my life. Every small success felt like a victory against everyone who had ever told me I didn't belong." "Do you ever miss it?" Daniel asked. "The simplicity of those early days." Clara considered this carefully. "Sometimes. There's something to be said for having a clear goal and knowing exactly what you need to do to achieve it. Now everything is more complicated: board meetings and shareholder reports and strategic planning sessions that go on for hours without reaching any real conclusions." "Maybe you need to remember why you started," Daniel suggested. "The woman who bought her first truck and drove it herself, she had a vision of something better. That vision is still there underneath all the corporate complexity." Clara looked at him with an expression that was part surprise, part admiration. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Cut through all the noise and see things so clearly. You have this way of getting to the heart of what really matters." Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks. I think you're giving me too much credit. Most of the time, I'm just trying to keep my head above water." "That's exactly what I mean," Clara said. "You've faced more real hardship than most people could imagine, but you haven't let it make you bitter or cynical. You still see the good in people, still believe that things can get better. That's a rare quality." Their eyes met across the table, and Daniel felt the now familiar jolt of connection that seemed to occur whenever they really looked at each other. The restaurant faded away around them, the soft murmur of conversation and clink of silverware becoming background noise to the intensity of the moment. "Clara," Daniel began, but he was interrupted by Lila dropping her sippy cup with a loud clatter that brought them both back to reality. As they cleaned up the mess and prepared to leave, Daniel found himself thinking about the evening's conversation and what it revealed about both of them. Clara's success story was inspiring, but it was also lonely. 30 years of sacrificing personal connections for professional achievement. His own journey had been the opposite, devastating professional failure, followed by the slow rebuilding of a life centered on love and family. Maybe that was why they understood each other so well. They had both lost everything and fought their way back, but they had chosen different paths for their recovery. Clara had armored herself with success and independence. Daniel had allowed himself to remain vulnerable, to depend on others, and let others depend on him. The drive back to Daniel's apartment was quiet, Lila having fallen asleep in her car seat. Clara followed them upstairs, ostensibly, to help carry the sleeping toddler, but Daniel suspected she was reluctant for the evening to end. As he settled Lila in her crib, Clara stood in the doorway, watching with an expression of such yearning that Daniel felt his heart break a little. When he joined her in the living room, she was staring out the window at the city lights below. "Thank you," she said softly. "For tonight, for dinner, for showing me what this feels like." What feels like belonging somewhere," Clara replied. "Feeling like part of something instead of just observing from the outside." Daniel moved to stand beside her at the window. "You do belong here, Clara. With us, I hope you know that." She turned to face him, and Daniel saw tears glistening in her silver eyes. "I want to believe that," she whispered. "But I'm scared, Daniel. I'm scared of wanting something so much that losing it would destroy me." "What if you don't lose it?" Daniel asked, stepping closer. "What if you let yourself want it, and it turns out to be everything you hoped for?" "And what if it doesn't?" Clara countered. "What if I'm too damaged, too set in my ways? What if I ruin it just by wanting it too much?" Daniel reached up and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said simply. "That's what people do when they care about each other. They work through the hard parts." "Do you care about me, Daniel?" The question was barely audible, as if she was afraid of the answer. "Yes," Daniel replied without hesitation. "More than I probably should, more than is sensible, and definitely more than I'm ready to admit to myself most of the time." Clara's breath caught, and for a moment they stood frozen in the charged space between confession and action. Then slowly, inevitably, they moved toward each other, their lips meeting in a kiss that was tender and desperate and full of all the words they hadn't yet found the courage to say. When they finally broke apart, Clara rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed and her breathing unsteady. "This changes everything," she whispered. "I know," Daniel replied. "Are you okay with that?" Clara opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression that was part terror, part hope, and entirely honest. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know I don't want to go back to pretending there's nothing between us." Before Daniel could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming text message. The name on the screen made his blood run cold. Detective Morrison. New developments in the case. Need to speak with you first thing Monday morning. Come alone. Clara saw his expression change and immediately looked concerned. What is it? Daniel showed her the message, and her face went pale. Monday morning, she said quietly. That's only 2 days away. Clara, whatever they've found, whatever they think they know. I know, she interrupted. I know you had nothing to do with this. But Daniel, if they arrest you, if they charge you with something you didn't do. The implications hung heavy between them. An arrest would mean Daniel losing his job, his apartment, possibly even custody of Lila. Everything they had built together, everything they had just acknowledged between them, could disappear in an instant. We'll figure it out, Daniel said, echoing his earlier words, but with less conviction this time. Clara nodded, but Daniel could see the fear in her eyes. They had just found each other, just admitted to feelings that had been building for months. The timing couldn't have been worse, or perhaps it was exactly the test they needed to determine whether what they felt was real enough to survive the storms ahead. As Clara prepared to leave, she turned back at the door with one final question. Daniel, no matter what happens on Monday, I need you to know something. What? Tonight was the best evening I've had in years, maybe in my entire life. Whatever comes next, I want you to remember that. After she left, Daniel sat in his living room staring at Detective Morrison's message and trying to make sense of the emotions churning in his chest. Fear for his future, anxiety about the investigation, but underneath it all, a warmth that hadn't been there before. For the first time since Sarah's death, he had allowed himself to love someone again. The timing was terrible, the circumstances were complicated, and the outcome was uncertain. But as he checked on Lila one final time before bed, Daniel found himself believing that love, real, honest, transformative love, was worth fighting for, no matter what Monday morning might bring. Monday morning arrived with the kind of brutal clarity that makes confronting harsh realities unavoidable. Daniel stood in the police station lobby at exactly 9 o'clock, his hands clammy with nervous sweat, as he waited for Detective Morrison. The weekend had passed in a haze of anxiety and restless preparation, punctuated by Clara's supportive phone calls and Lila's blissfully oblivious laughter. Now, facing the possibility that his world might come crashing down, Daniel tried to summon the courage that had carried him through Sarah's death and the rebuilding of his life. Mr. Hayes. Detective Morrison's gravelly voice cut through his thoughts. Thank you for coming in. Follow me. The interview room was exactly what Daniel had expected from countless crime dramas: bare walls, fluorescent lighting, and a metal table that had seen better decades. Morrison sat across from him, with a thick file folder, his expression unreadable. Before we begin, Morrison said, I want to make something clear. You're not under arrest, and you're free to leave at any time. However, I strongly recommend you hear what I have to say. Daniel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Morrison opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs. Do you recognize this man? Daniel found himself staring at a surveillance photo of a thin, dark-haired man in coveralls entering the Monroe Industries facility. Something about the face was familiar, but he couldn't place it. I'm not sure, Daniel said honestly. He looks familiar, but I can't place where I might have seen him. His name is Marcus Webb, Morrison continued. He was employed by Monroe Industries as a night janitor for approximately 3 months, ending 2 weeks before the security breach. According to his background check, he previously worked for a company called Coastal Logistics. The name hit Daniel like a physical blow. Coastal Logistics, he repeated slowly. That's Harrison Enterprises' shipping division. Morrison's eyebrows rose. You know Harrison Enterprises? They were my biggest competitor when I had my construction company. Daniel explained, his mind racing. Richard Harrison made it very clear that he didn't appreciate newcomers trying to break into his territory. When my company went under, he was the one who bought up most of my contracts at bargain prices. Interesting, Morrison said, making notes. Tell me more about your relationship with Harrison. Daniel thought back to those bitter final months of his construction business, when everything had been falling apart, and Richard Harrison had seemed to take personal pleasure in his struggles. There was no relationship, Daniel said finally. Harrison saw me as a threat and made sure I knew it. When Sarah got sick and I had to take time away from the business, he moved in like a vulture. By the time I was ready to fight back, there was nothing left to fight for. Morrison pulled out another document. We've been investigating Marcus Webb's finances, and we found some interesting deposits in his bank account. Large cash payments that coincide with his employment at Monroe Industries. When we traced the money, it led us to a shell company that's ultimately owned by Harrison Enterprises. The implications of this revelation crashed over Daniel like a tidal wave. Harrison was paying Webb to sabotage Monroe Industries. That's what it looks like, Morrison confirmed. But here's where it gets interesting. Webb claims he never met you, never spoke to you, and had no idea you worked there until after he was caught. He says his instructions came through encrypted messages and dead drops, very sophisticated operation. Daniel felt a mixture of relief and confusion. So I'm not a suspect anymore. You never really were, Morrison admitted with something approaching an apology. But we had to investigate every angle. Your financial history made you a potential target for recruitment. But everyone we interviewed spoke about your character in terms that made it clear you weren't involved. What happens now? Now we build a case against Harrison and Webb. But I have to warn you, Harrison is a powerful man with expensive lawyers. This is going to be a long, complicated process, and Monroe Industries will be under scrutiny throughout the investigation. Daniel nodded, already thinking about Clara and what this meant for her business. Detective, can I ask you something? Shoot. Why did Harrison target Monroe Industries specifically? I mean, Clara's company is successful, but she's not his only competitor. Morrison's expression grew grim. According to Webb's testimony, this wasn't just about business competition. Apparently, Harrison has been nursing a grudge against Ms. Monroe for years. She beat him out for several major contracts when she was first starting out, and he's never forgotten it. This was personal as much as professional. The idea that Clara had been targeted because of some petty vendetta made Daniel's blood boil. She had built her success through hard work and determination, not corporate sabotage and dirty tricks. The fact that Harrison had tried to destroy what she had worked so hard to create felt like a personal attack on everything Daniel had come to admire about her. Can I go now? Daniel asked. I need to tell Clara what's happening. Actually, Morrison said, standing up. She's waiting outside. I called her after our interview began, figured she'd want to hear this firsthand. Daniel found Clara pacing in the lobby, her usual composure cracked by anxiety and anger. The moment she saw him, she rushed over, her eyes searching his face for answers. What did they tell you? She asked urgently. It's over, Daniel said simply. I'm clear. It was Harrison Enterprises behind everything. Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief, and Daniel instinctively reached out to steady her. Richard Harrison, she said, and her voice carried a venom Daniel had never heard before. I should have known. Morrison said it was personal, that Harrison had been carrying a grudge for years. Clara's laugh was bitter. A grudge. Of course. I beat him fair and square for the Morrison account 7 years ago, ironically, the detective's family construction company, and apparently that wounded his precious ego enough to justify corporate espionage. As they walked out of the police station together, Daniel felt the weight of the past few days finally lifting from his shoulders. The relief was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by a new concern: what this revelation meant for Clara's business and their relationship. "Clara," he said, as they reached their cars. "What happens now? With the investigation, with the company, with us?" Clara turned to face him, and Daniel saw something in her silver eyes that he hadn't seen before, a kind of fierce determination that went beyond mere business success. "Now," she said quietly, "we fight back. Harrison thinks he can destroy what I've built. He's about to learn exactly how wrong he is." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of legal meetings, security upgrades, and strategic planning sessions. Clara threw herself into the response to Harrison's sabotage with the same intensity she had once applied to building her empire. Daniel found himself drawn deeper into the corporate side of Monroe Industries, his insights into Harrison's tactics proving invaluable as they worked to prevent future attacks. But it was during the quiet moments between the chaos that their relationship truly deepened. Clara began stopping by Daniel's apartment more frequently, often bringing dinner or helping with Lila's bedtime routine. Daniel, in turn, found himself staying late at the office to help Clara work through the complex legal and financial implications of the case. They didn't talk about what was happening between them. Both seemed to understand that the current crisis required their full attention. But the foundation they were building was solid, constructed from shared values and mutual respect rather than mere attraction. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in November. Daniel was reviewing security footage with Clara in her office when her phone rang. The conversation was brief, but Daniel could see the satisfaction spreading across her face as she listened. "That was Morrison," she said after hanging up. "They arrested Harrison this afternoon." Webb's testimony, combined with the financial evidence and the surveillance footage, was enough for the district attorney to file charges. Daniel felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by concern for Clara. "How are you feeling about all this?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city lights beyond her office windows. "Relieved," she said finally, "but also empty somehow. I've been so focused on fighting Harrison that I haven't thought about what comes after." "What do you want to come after?" Clara turned to look at him, and Daniel saw vulnerability in her expression that he was learning to recognize as her truest self. "I want to build something that lasts," she said softly. "Not just a business empire, but something that matters. Something that makes the world a little bit better." "You already have," Daniel pointed out. "Look at what you've done for the community center, for your employees, for people like me who needed a second chance." "That's not enough anymore," Clara replied. "I used to think success was about proving that I belonged, that I was worthy of respect. But watching you with Lila, seeing how you've rebuilt your life around love instead of ambition, it's changed my perspective on what really matters." Daniel stood up and moved to join her at the window. "Clara, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to try something I've never been brave enough to attempt before," she said, turning to face him. "I want to build a life that's about more than just work. I want to try being happy instead of just successful." The words hung between them, loaded with possibility and fear in equal measure. Daniel reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers as he had done so many times over the past few weeks. "I want that too," he said quietly. "But Clara, you need to know that loving me means loving Lila too. We're a package deal, and she has to come first in my life. I won't compromise on that." Clara's smile was radiant. Daniel, that's exactly why I love you. The fact that Lila comes first, that you're the kind of man who would sacrifice anything for his daughter, that's not a limitation. It's what makes you extraordinary. The confession hung in the air between them, unexpected and perfect. Daniel felt his heart expand, with a joy he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. But it was different this time, deeper, more mature, tempered by the knowledge of how precious and fragile love could be. "I love you too," he said, and the words felt like coming home. Their kiss was interrupted by the sound of Daniel's phone buzzing. Lila's photo appeared on the screen, and Daniel realized with a start that he was supposed to have picked her up from Mrs. Rodriguez an hour ago. "Go," Clara said, laughing at his panicked expression. "Take care of your daughter. We'll have plenty of time to figure out the rest." But as Daniel hurried home through the rain-soaked streets, he found himself thinking that maybe they already had figured it out. Love, he was learning, wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It was about showing up consistently, choosing each other daily, and building something beautiful from the ordinary moments of everyday life. Mrs. Rodriguez met him at the door with Lila in her arms and a knowing smile on her weathered face. "You look different, mijo," she observed. "Happy. It's been a long time since I've seen you look truly happy." "I feel different," Daniel admitted, taking Lila and holding her close. "Like maybe the future is going to be brighter than I thought possible. And the angel from your work, the one who looks at you like you hung the moon." Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I think maybe she's going to be around for a long time." Mrs. Rodriguez clapped her hands together with delight. "Bueno, it's about time. That little girl needs a mama, and you need someone who sees how special you are." That night, as Daniel put Lila to bed, he found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 2 years ago, he had been a broken man, with a dying wife and a failing business. A year ago, he had been a struggling single father, counting coins in a corner store. Now he was part of something larger than himself, a family that was unconventional, but real, built on choice rather than obligation. The next few months passed in a blur of positive changes. Harrison's trial made headlines vindicating Clara and exposing the lengths to which some people would go to destroy their competitors. Monroe Industries emerged from the crisis stronger than ever, with new security measures and a renewed focus on corporate responsibility. Daniel was promoted to assistant fleet manager, a position that came with increased responsibilities and a salary that allowed him to start thinking about buying a house. More importantly, it gave him the confidence to see himself as Clara's equal rather than her charity case. Clara, meanwhile, began the process of restructuring her priorities. She hired additional executives to handle day-to-day operations, freeing herself to focus on strategic planning and the aspects of the business that truly energized her. She also began exploring opportunities for philanthropy that went beyond simple donations, creating programs that would have lasting impact on the communities they served. But the most significant change was in their relationship. What had begun as friendship and evolved into attraction had now deepened into something that felt unshakable. They spent evenings together at Daniel's apartment, with Clara often staying to help with Lila's bedtime routine. Weekends were spent exploring the city, with Lila in tow, visiting museums and parks and farmers markets, like the family they were slowly becoming. The moment that changed everything came on a snowy December evening, exactly 1 year after their encounter in Miller's Corner store. Daniel had been planning something special for weeks with the help of Mrs. Rodriguez and, surprisingly, Father Miguel from the community center. Clara arrived at the apartment expecting their usual quiet dinner, but instead found candles lighting the way to the living room, where Daniel waited with Lila in his arms and a small velvet box in his pocket. "Daniel?" Clara breathed, taking in the romantic scene. "What is all this?" "This," Daniel said, his voice steady, despite the nervous energy coursing through him, "is me asking you to make our family official." He knelt down on one knee, balancing Lila carefully, as he pulled out the ring, a simple but elegant solitaire that had taken him months to save for. "Clara Monroe," he said, looking up at her with all the love and certainty he felt, "you saved my life in that store a year ago. But you've done so much more than that. You've shown me what it means to hope again, to dream again, to believe that the future can be better than the past. You've become Lila's other parent, and my best friend, and the love of my life, all wrapped up in one extraordinary woman." Clara's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the man who had transformed her understanding of what was possible. "I know we're not conventional," Daniel continued. "I know our timing wasn't perfect, and our circumstances were complicated. But I also know that what we have is real and rare and worth fighting for. So I'm asking you, will you marry me? Will you help me raise this beautiful little girl? Will you build a life with us that's about love instead of just survival?" Clara sank to her knees in front of him, her silver eyes blazing with joy and certainty. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Daniel Hayes, I will marry you and love you and help you raise this perfect daughter of ours." As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, Lila clapped her hands and babbled excitedly, as if she understood that something momentous was happening. The three of them sat there on the living room floor, holding each other and crying happy tears while snow fell softly outside the windows. Later that evening, after Lila was asleep and they were planning their future together, Clara pulled out a small jewelry box of her own. "I have something for you too," she said, opening the box to reveal a silver locket on a delicate chain. "It belonged to my foster mother, the only one who ever made me feel like I belonged. She gave it to me before I left her house, and I've carried it ever since." Daniel opened the locket and found two tiny photos inside, one of Clara as a young girl and one that took his breath away. It was a picture of himself taken during his construction days, standing in front of a house he had built. But it was the dedication on the back that made him gasp. "For the Hayes family, your forever home. Built with love, 2019. "I don't understand," Daniel said, staring at the photo. "How did you—" "The house you built for the Henderson family," Clara said softly. "The one with the blue shutters and the wraparound porch. I bought it 6 months ago. I've been having it renovated, adding a nursery and a bigger kitchen and a workshop where you can tinker with engines on the weekends." Daniel stared at her in amazement. "You bought the house I built?" "I bought our house," Clara corrected. "The house where our daughter will grow up, where we'll host holidays and birthday parties and all the ordinary moments that make a life extraordinary. I bought the house where we'll prove that families aren't just born, they're built by people who choose to love each other every single day." As they sat together making plans for their wedding and their future, Daniel marveled at the strange perfection of their story. A year ago, he had been a man at the end of his rope, defeated by circumstances beyond his control. Clara had been a successful but lonely woman who had achieved everything except the thing she wanted most. Now they were building something together that neither of them could have created alone, a family forged from choice and strengthened by shared purpose. The wedding took place the following spring in the garden of the house Daniel had built and Clara had claimed for their family. Father Miguel officiated while Mrs. Rodriguez served as matron of honor, and Frank Rodriguez walked Clara down the aisle. Lila toddled between them, wearing a tiny white dress, carrying a basket of rose petals that she scattered with gleeful abandon. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended by the community of people who had supported them through their individual struggles and celebrated their joint triumph. Tony was there with his wife, beaming with pride at his former employee's success. The entire team from Monroe Industries came along with families from the community center who had benefited from Clara's generosity over the years. But the moment that made Daniel's heart overflow was when Clara knelt down to Lila's level during the exchange of vows and made a promise that brought tears to every eye in the garden. "Lila Marie Hayes," Clara said solemnly, "I promise to love you and protect you and help you become the amazing woman I already see in you. I promise to read you bedtime stories and kiss your scraped knees and cheer at every soccer game and school play. I promise to be the mother your heart needs even though I didn't give birth to you. You are my daughter now and always, and I will never let you doubt how precious you are." 2-year-old Lila responded by throwing her arms around Clara's neck and declaring loudly, "Mama," for the first time sending a collective sigh of joy through the assembled guests. As they danced their first dance as a married couple, while Lila played at their feet, Daniel thought about the conversation they'd had in the corner store that had started it all. Clara had said then that she'd been where he was, that she knew what it was like to count pennies and come up short. Now he understood that the shortfall they had both experienced wasn't really about money. It was about love, family, belonging, and the courage to hope for something better. They had both been counting the wrong currency, measuring their worth in dollars instead of connections, success instead of significance. It had taken meeting each other to realize that the riches they were seeking couldn't be earned or bought. They could only be built one choice at a time, one act of love at a time, one ordinary moment at a time. 5 years later, Daniel stood in the same garden, watching Clara push their 3-year-old son Marcus on the swing set he had built the previous summer. Lila, now 7 and fierce and brilliant, was teaching her little brother the finer points of proper swinging technique with the same patience Clara had once shown Daniel. "Higher, Mama!" Marcus called, his laughter bright and infectious. "I want to touch the clouds." "Hold on tight, sweetheart," Clara called back, her voice filled with the easy joy of a woman who had finally found her place in the world. Daniel smiled, thinking about the foundation they had established. Not Monroe Industries, though it continued to thrive under Clara's enlightened leadership, but the Second Chance Foundation they had created together. It provided support for single parents, job training for people trying to rebuild their lives, and emergency assistance for families facing crisis. Clara ran the operations side while Daniel oversaw the direct services, using his own experience to connect with people who needed hope more than they needed charity. "Daddy," Lila called, running over to where he stood watching his family. "Marcus says he's going to fly like Superman, but I told him people can't really fly. Tell him—" "Well," Daniel said, lifting his daughter onto his shoulders, "maybe people can't fly exactly like Superman, but sometimes they can soar in other ways. Sometimes they can rise above circumstances that seemed impossible to overcome. Sometimes they can build something beautiful from nothing but hope and hard work and love." "Like you and Mama did?" Lila asked with the straightforward wisdom of a child who had grown up hearing the story of how her family came to be. "Exactly like that, princess," Daniel replied, watching Clara laugh as Marcus pumped his legs harder, determined to reach those clouds. "Exactly like that." As the sun set over the garden of the house he had built with his hands, and Clara had filled with her heart, Daniel reflected on the strange mathematics of love. A year ago, no, a lifetime ago, he had stood in a corner store counting coins and coming up short. Now he was surrounded by abundance that couldn't be calculated in any currency that mattered to banks or accountants. He had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars and cents, but in moments like these, a wife's laughter, a son's determination to touch the sky, a daughter's questions about the world and her place in it. He had learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or earned, only given and received with open hearts and willing hands. And he had learned that sometimes when you think you've lost everything, you're actually standing at the beginning of everything you never knew you wanted. Sometimes the person who saves you is the person you save in return. Sometimes the family you choose becomes more real than the family you were born into. Sometimes love finds you in the most unexpected places, like a corner store where you're counting coins and coming up short, and a stranger appears to teach you that there are riches beyond anything you've ever imagined. The story that had begun with Daniel's last dollar had become a legacy measured in lives changed, families supported, and hope restored. It was a reminder that every ending is also a beginning. Every loss contains the seeds of unexpected gain, and every act of kindness creates ripples that extend far beyond what the giver could ever imagine. As night fell over their garden, over their home, over their extraordinary, ordinary life, Daniel held his family close and whispered a prayer of gratitude for corner stores and guardian angels, and the mysterious way that broken souls find each other across the crowded spaces of the world. The best stories he had learned were the ones that began with someone deciding not to give up and ended with love multiplying beyond all expectation or explanation. Their story was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, adventures to be had, children to raise, dreams to chase and love to give away, until their hearts were empty and full at the same time. But tonight, in this moment, in this place, they had built together from nothing but faith and determination, and the radical decision to believe in each other. Everything was exactly as it should be. The little girl who had once been told she didn't belong had found her home. The man who had lost everything had discovered that he had never really lost what mattered most. And together they had built something that would last long after they were gone, a family, a foundation, a legacy of love that proved beyond any doubt that the best investments were the ones you couldn't calculate, the ones that paid dividends in laughter and hope, and the sweet chaos of children who believe they can touch the clouds.